The Tuolumne River rises high in the Sierra Nevada on the snow-capped peaks of Yosemite National Park. Streams that originate on the slopes of Mount Lyell and Mount Dana, both over 13,000 feet in elevation, combine with snow-fed creeks to form the river's main stem and drain an area of 1,800 square miles. The Tuolumne gains in volume and velocity as it rushes off the western slope of the Sierra, plunging through steep canyons and into a series of reservoirs before it flows into New Don Pedro Reservoir, the final stop on its journey to the Pacific Ocean. Original Don Pedro Dam was completed by the Turlock and Modesto irrigation districts in 1923. As the first major storage reservoir on the Tuolumne River, it was capable of providing enough water to accommodate the irrigation needs of the two districts' farmers during most single growing seasons. While Old Don Pedro also endowed the districts with the ability to generate enough electricity to provide for the needs of their growing service areas, it was not designed or intended as a significant source of flood protection. In many wet years, it was commonplace to see torrents of water cascading over the spillway and through the bypass tubes on its way unobstructed into the floodplain and the valley below. Don Pedro is fed by water released from San Francisco's three upstream reservoirs, Hetch Hetchy, Eleanor, and Cherry, and runoff from the creeks and rivers entering the Tuolumne River into the 62-mile-long stretch in between.
To gain some perspective about the days leading up to the New Year's flood of 1997, consider that December 1996 was the third wettest in recorded history in the Tuolumne River watershed. At 15.8 inches of precipitation, it was more than twice the 50-year average. On Sunday morning, December 29th, Don Pedro's water level rested at 806.8 feet elevation above sea level, or at 86% of its total storage capacity. There was still room in the reservoir to accommodate an additional 283,600 acre-feet of water. And then the unimaginable happened. The so-called Pineapple Express, a tropical storm from Hawaii, raged across the state, dumping torrents of warm water and melting the mid-range Sierra snowpack. Water rushed into Don Pedro with such force it dislodged the log jam that resided at the mouth of the lake. The log jam and other debris coming downriver shot several hundred yards into Moccasin Bay, clogging boat traffic and miring houseboats moored at the Moccasin Point Marina in a sea of debris. A gigantic plume of brown, muddy water surged nearly halfway into the 26-mile-long lake. Don Pedro Reservoir continued to rise. At 4 p.m. on January 2nd, with the water level within 3 feet of the top of the spillway, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers instructed the district to commence controlled emergency releases. The emergency procedure, the first ever, was necessary to protect the rock and earthen-fill dam from heavy inflows and to create additional space for runoff anticipated from a series of new storms stacked up in the Pacific waiting to move on shore. Outflow through the powerhouse flood control valve and river outlet works was immediately ramped up to 14,320 cubic feet per second, the largest volume of water ever channeled through and around the powerhouse at the same time. The stepped-up releases also were designed to help maintain a clear channel in the river when tons of earth, gravel, trees, and other debris entered the canyon after the spillway gates were opened under emergency conditions for the first time in the reservoir's 26 years of existence. The ensuing rush of water through the spillway washed out Bond's Flat Road and carved a deep gorge in what had been a pastoral, tree-infested hillside, the entire length of Twin Gulch to the Tuolumne River Canyon, about a mile below the dam and powerhouse. The first of the 3 spillway gates was lowered at 6 p.m. The historic event was witnessed by a handful of TID employees who used the headlights of their pickup trucks to illuminate the rushing water as it roared over the roadway and disappeared in the darkness on its way to rejoin the Tuolumne River. By that time, Don Pedro's water level had risen to within 1.5 feet of the top of the spillway. Ominously, it continued to climb. TID contacted the Stanislaus County Office of Emergency Services on New Year's Day, alerting them to the possible need to make emergency releases from Don Pedro and the advisability of warning people along the river to be prepared for high river flows. The notification was made more than 24 hours before any emergency releases were made at the dam. Fortunately, there is a lag time of between 22 and 24 hours before water leaving Don Pedro reaches Modesto, thus providing valuable time for people to load up many of their belongings and move to higher ground.
In the first 2 days of January alone, 7.61 inches of precipitation was recorded in the Tuolumne River watershed, nearly 1.5 inches more than the 50-year average for the entire month. Don Pedro Reservoir filled rapidly. On New Year's Day, the lake level rose nearly 8 feet to 819 feet above sea level. A new one-day record was set the very next day when massive inflow that exceeded 100,000 cubic feet per second for 11 consecutive hours pushed the reservoir level up 11 more feet. All Don Pedro inflow records were smashed at 6 p.m. on January 2nd when inflow peaked at 120,816 cubic feet per second. When the Turlock and Modesto irrigation districts and the city and county of San Francisco finished building new Don Pedro in 1971, its increased storage capacity of slightly more than 2 million acre-feet made it the 6th largest body of water in California and one capable of sustaining growers' irrigation needs during multiple years of drought. Flood protection improved substantially with the completion of the new dam. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers contributed more than $5 million to provide additional space within the reservoir to accommodate heavy runoff that in high water years frequently flooded low-lying areas below the dam.
Don Pedro Recreation Agency personnel closed the lake to boaters and established roadblocks on Bond's Flat Road before it was washed away by the flow through the spillway.
By virtue of its financial contribution, the Corps governs reservoir operations through a flood control operations manual that automatically goes into effect whenever Don Pedro's water level reaches 801.9 feet above sea level between the months of October and April. With a peak elevation of 830 feet above sea level, the seasonal flood storage reservation provides a 28-foot gap in the reservoir capable of accommodating 360,000 acre-feet of water.
TID and MID personnel sealed off the district's respective canal systems to prevent logs and other debris washing down from Twin Gulch from clogging the diversion works at LaGrange Dam. TID employees waged a major battle to keep the small powerhouse along the river's edge at the foot of LaGrange Dam from being destroyed by erosion from the torrents of water that came rushing over the crest of the old dam. At one point, water flowing over the top of the overpour dam reached 12 feet in height.
Corps of Engineers imposed outflow restrictions are designed to prevent flooding of urban and agricultural areas developed within the river floodplain before and since New Don Pedro went into service in 1971. The Flood Control Operation Manual for Don Pedro restricts flows to no more than 9,000 cubic feet per second in the Tuolumne River as measured at the 9th Street Bridge in Modesto. Compounding matters, Don Pedro outflow must be reduced to compensate for runoff from Dry Creek, an unregulated tributary that drains stormwater that collects in the foothills northeast of Modesto. Dry Creek eventually empties into the Tuolumne River, where it is added to existing river flow measurements registered at the U.S. Geological Survey Station near the 9th Street Bridge. As a result of Dry Creek runoff, Don Pedro releases into the Tuolumne Range from as little as 2,400 cubic feet per second to a high of 8,700 cubic feet per second between December 10th, when the reservoir level entered the flood control area, and January 2nd, when the emergency spill procedures were activated. Despite emergency releases, the reservoir level continued to climb. At 4 a.m. on January 3rd, it crowned at 831.39 feet above sea level, a foot higher than the reservoir's designed maximum storage capacity. By that time, Water already was rushing over the 1,000-foot-long concrete apron adjacent to the spillway gates. The weir and spillway gates operated exactly as they were designed, choking off heavy reservoir inflows while at the same time protecting the earth and rock-filled dam from high inflows and record water levels. Despite rumors perpetuated by the television news media, the integrity of Don Pedro Dam was never in question.
The Turlock Irrigation District went on an around-the-clock alert as the emergency situation continued to develop. Electric line crews and troubleshooters were dispatched to flood-prone areas throughout the district to disconnect and later reestablish electrical service to affected homes and businesses. Other district workers began patrolling riverbanks, canals, and ditches in search of potential problems and physically ushering massive amounts of rain runoff from cities and other sources through the canal system. Employees representing virtually every other discipline in the district also sprang into action, responding to customers' calls for help and information, and coordinating efforts with OES and the many relief agencies working feverishly to aid flood victims. TID remained closely linked to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which already had assumed control over the operation of the reservoir and dictated flood control procedures. Communications links were also established with the State Department of Water Resources, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and virtually every flood management agency involved in statewide disaster response and planning. TID personnel also relied on National Weather Service forecasters and other sources of weather data for information that assisted in plotting a strategy to get through the difficult period. In the days that followed the initial spillway releases, TID maintained extremely close contact with the Office of Emergency Services and local police, fire, and other emergency services agencies, providing hourly reports on reservoir inflow and outflow, and regularly attending daily command and/or media briefings. A century from now, a hydrologist looking only at seasonal rainfall totals in the Turlock Irrigation District would assume that the 1996-1997 water year was fairly average. After all, the Valley region recorded about 13.5 inches of rain for the year, very close to the 100-year average. What the unsuspecting hydrologist wouldn't realize from looking solely at that statistic is that it was one of the most erratic water years in the upper watershed's recorded history. In fact, it was downright bizarre. It started out innocently enough, all right, a bit dry at first, but nothing unusual to an irrigation district accustomed to long, hot summers and recurring periods of drought. Between July 1st and September 30th, nary a drop of rain fell in the Turlock region. While there was some rain in October and November, the water year was still shaping up as below average. However, any significant concerns about a full-fledged drought year at that time were soothed by the knowledge that the 3 preceding water years were good ones. Plenty of water remained in Don Pedro Reservoir after the foregoing irrigation season concluded in October to sustain growers' needs for at least another year if dry conditions persisted.
But those dry conditions didn't persist. The rainy season arrived in late November, when a series of cold, wet storms began pounding California, soaking the Central Valley and the foothills and leaving a thick carpet of snow on the Sierras. As November came to an end, Don Pedro was still well below the level reserved to absorb runoff that traditionally flows out of the mountains during the spring snowmelt. New storms that materialized in early December intensified in duration and output, pushing the reservoir's water level fractionally into the flood reservation area for the first time. Don Pedro was drawn back below the limit through routine powerhouse releases, as prescribed by the Corps of Engineers Flood Control Operation Manual. Ironically, the Tuolumne River watershed received a whopping 71% of its total precipitation for the 1996-97 water year in the months of December and January. Between October and January, rainfall totaled 42¼ inches, or 243% more than the average accumulation for an entire year. And then there was nothing. After January, rainfall was virtually non-existent. Only slightly more than a ½ inch in the 5 months between February and the end of June. TID's irrigation season began in early March, about a week earlier than usual due to extremely dry weather conditions that in any other year would have constituted a drought. Due to adequate advance warning and the diligent efforts of emergency services personnel, no deaths or even serious injuries were reported in relation to the Tuolumne River flooding event. Some estimates pegged the number of flooded homes in Stanislaus County at 800. Approximately 3,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes and businesses. Statewide, the New Year's storm killed 9 people, forced evacuation of 120,000, and caused as much as $2 billion worth of damage. One of the most serious consequences of the Tuolumne River flooding was the inundation of the city of Modesto's sewage treatment plant, located in the floodplain west of Highway 99. Raw sewage spilled into the river and washed downstream for several days until the river receded. As a result of this extraordinary and unparalleled event, it is clear that careful consideration must be given to prospective changes that will further enhance flood control operations while minimizing extreme high flows in the lower Tuolumne River. Among key possibilities advanced early on by the Turlock Irrigation District were increasing the Corps of Engineers' flow limitations in the Tuolumne River at the 9th Street Bridge in Modesto from 9,000 cubic feet per second to between 15 and 20,000 cubic feet per second. Restricting development in the floodplain and relocating some previously existing residential land uses. Developing short-term storm water retention facilities along Dry Creek. Erecting a retaining wall around the City of Modesto wastewater treatment plant to protect it from high river flows. Constructing or strengthening levees to protect the Airport, La Loma, Carpenter Road, and Hatch Road districts. And finally, reinforcing the Tuolumne River levee system downstream of Modesto.
There's little doubt in anyone's mind that devastation and damage below the dam would have been significantly greater had new Don Pedro Dam never been built. The first reduction in outflow was initiated just after midnight on January 4th as the lake level finally began to recede. While all 3 spillway gates were partially open at the height of the emergency, they were gradually closed until the final gate was secured at 1 p.m. on January 10th. By the end of that day, the reservoir level had dropped to 813 feet elevation. Total releases into the river below the dam had been returned to the pre-flood limit of 9,000 cubic feet per second. As for the New Year's flood, there are a couple of important distinctions that can be made. While the flood reservation area incorporated in New Don Pedro may have provided a measure of comfort for those whose businesses and homes were located in the floodplain below the dam, no guarantees were ever made that downstream flooding would never happen again. If that had been the case, there would have been no necessity for emergency spillway gates and an overpour weir when the new dam was built in the late 1960s and early 70s. Next, the Tuolumne River remained within its channel and the historically recognized floodplain well beyond Modesto. As evidence, it is worth noting that the river never reached a level where any bridges were submerged by rushing water. Those that were knocked out of service were closed as a result of piling or abutment erosion. It also needs to be pointed out that roads inundated in the area primarily between West Modesto and the Tuolumne's confluence with the San Joaquin River were flooded largely as a result of weakened or inadequate levees that failed.
episode was one of the most extraordinary events in recorded history on the Tuolumne River. Before it was over, all Don Pedro inflow records would be shattered by substantial margins. For the 10-day period between December 29th and January 8th, the reservoir absorbed more than 600,000 acre-feet of water, almost 80% more than the total space reserved for seasonal flood control and one-third of the average annual runoff in any given year. Don Pedro outflow peaked at approximately 59,000 cubic feet per second at 2 a.m. on Friday, January 3rd, and remained above 50,000 cubic feet per second for the next 23 hours. Releases amounted to half as much as what was coming in, a scene mirrored at other flood-soaked reservoirs throughout the state.
Don Pedro's major structures and facilities, including all 3 radial spillway gates, bypasses and diversion tunnels, and control systems, performed exactly as they were designed to perform. In the aftermath of the New Year's flood, one of the district's first orders of business was to rebuild the stretch of Bonds Flat Road washed away when the spillway gates were activated. The washout forced vehicular traffic from Turlock, Modesto, and other points west to detour several miles to get to the dam and powerhouse, Recreation Agency headquarters building, and popular Fleming Meadows recreation area. The second was dredging out tons of sand and gravel that washed down Twin Gulch into the Tuolumne River Canyon. The debris created a dike that forced water to back up to the dam and powerhouse, reducing the efficiency of the hydroelectric turbine generators and causing vibration problems. A contractor removed 110,000 cubic yards of material from the river bottom, finishing the project in late June. The new channel returned the river to its normal elevation and solved the vibration problem at the powerhouse.
In the final analysis, Don Pedro Dam operated exactly as it was designed to operate, buffering the potential disastrous effects of high river flows and ultimately sparing Modesto and other communities along the river from even more extensive flood damage. The 1996-97 water year began with a bang and ended with a murmur. It's one that will be analyzed, discussed, and debated for many years to come.